Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History. My name is Derek Taylor, your host for Controversies in Church History, a podcast that takes you through the most important, interesting, and eventful people, places, ideas in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. Welcome to you all. Welcome to all my listeners. I want to begin by thanking all my listeners. Thank you guys who have been I know you've been subscribing lately to the YouTube channel or to or my Patreon account. Thank you to the I have 2 subscribers so far, 2 patrons. Very thankful. Brian Dykstra, old friend from Kansas City, and Devin Rice recently subscribed. Thank both of you. Really humbled by your efforts to support me, and and urge all of you, like what you hear on the podcast, like the content, like what I'm trying to do, please go and subscribe on Anchor is where I'm based out of the podcast, but Apple Podcast has it, Spotify, all the major platforms do. And please go and do it if you use those. Please go there and leave a comment. If you want to, give me feedback and everything. You can also do that obviously on YouTube. I'm trying to be more responsive to everyone, and I'll talk about some more of this stuff at the end of this episode. But I wanted to just get that out there, trying to build some more community with listeners and get in touch with you guys, and thank all of you who've supported me so far. And one last thing. This is just personal. This is the first podcast in a while, first episode. I have moved from Kansas to Florida, back home where I'm from, so that's why it took so long to get to this. But today we have a long-awaited series beginning, so let's get started and get into that with the first episode of our series on Latinization. And what is it? Why does it matter? And I want to begin by talking about a recent crisis in the church you may not have heard of. Maybe if you listened to this podcast, you did. And it's not a crisis in the Latin Church, the Church of Rome. It's a crisis in the Syro-Malabar Church of India. The term Syro-Malabar refers to, on the one hand, Syro, the Syrian. It's an Eastern Syriac liturgy in the Syriac language. Malabar refers to the region of India, southern India, in which these Catholic Christians in communion with Rome are based. And if you don't know, the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church is very old. It traces its ancestry back to St. Thomas, who by tradition was supposed to have gone and witnessed to Christ in India. And so you have this ancient church there, but you've had for the past 5 years, more than 5 years now, a running liturgy war in this church, in which you've had people brawling in the streets. You've had laity burning pastoral letters of their bishop, whom they dislike, burning cardinals in effigy. You even had at the basilica in the Diocese of Ernakulam, I think is the name of that. I'm not pronouncing that right, but Ernakulam, which is the center of all this, St. Mary's Basilica. You had a riot break out, groups clashing, in the cathedral, throwing sacred vessels everywhere. And so, what's the origin of all this? Well, it's actually kind of complicated, but to give you, a gradual, we're going to have an episode just on this toward the end of this series, but. For a long time, it had experienced centuries of what we're going to call Latinization. That is to say, its liturgy, some of its customs had been, they've been sort of not taken over, but they've been, influenced by the Latin Rite. But starting in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Vatican, then culminating at Vatican II, Rome had tried to give this community more autonomy, began to get it to rediscover its distinctive traditions. However, they ran into a problem after the Second Vatican Council. That problem was that it ceased to have a uniform liturgy. And the reason why, the liturgy they call the Holy Corbana in the Syriac churches, and the reason why is that after Vatican II, a Latin practice crept into the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church. That practice was the liturgy with the priest facing the people, which was on all sides in this dispute, and there's serious disputes here, as you can kind of tell, agree this was a novelty. It was something they had imported from Rome as a matter of, wanting to, be up to date with the latest, I guess, trends coming from the West. And so it led to this shift where the majority of the people in this diocese, the majority of the priests they celebrate the liturgy facing the people. And so when the Vatican wanted, trying to get this church to rediscover its distinctive identity and undo the Latinization, these people in this diocese, reacted really angrily to this. And there are other things going on besides this. There's been some shady land dealings by the archdiocese, and this, there are other things going on they're angry about. But this sort of has culminated in this just amazing standoff over the liturgy, in which the Vatican has tried to come up with a compromise liturgy, where basically for half the time the priest will be facing the people, the other half of the time he'll be facing the altar as is traditional in that rite, but to no avail as of yet. There's still a standoff at this moment over these topics. And so why do I begin with that example, what we call Latinization? Because that's kind of what's happened to the Syro-Malabar Rite. And the reason why is because in what we call Latinization, that's basically what you have the definition here, the replacement of the influence of liturgical or disciplinary customs of the Latin tradition onto the Eastern churches. And again, why are we talking about this here? What's controversial about all this? Well, you know what? The thing is, this probably wouldn't have been a controversy for the most part for most people in the West before the 1960s. Why? Because it's in the 1960s and really in the post-war world, post-World War II era in Western Europe, where the whole idea of multiculturalism comes to the fore. If you don't know, the term multicultural only dates as an adjective from 1935 in English. It's actually invented by an American sociologist, or first used by it in the 1930s. But multiculturalism as an idea only dates from the 1950s. It's clearly a product of the post-World War II, post-Holocaust era, in which the great sort of liberal internationalist idea came about that, lack of respect for other cultures led to bad things like the Holocaust and World War II. And so the term Latinization, I don't know this for a fact, as far as I'm aware, kind of goes back to the 60s and almost certainly to Vatican II, because Vatican II was concerned about culture and enculturation and all those buzzwords that came out of it. Even though, by the way, the term Latinization in English actually goes back to the 1830s, but it only referred to the translation of Greek words into Latin. And all this is controversial because, of course, before the 60s, the church tended to exalt its Latin heritage. If you want to read a good example of, I think, some of the best of this, this love for Latin, this thinking of it as being the language of the universal church and being, the greatest thing in the world. There's a book by Cardinal Antonio Bacci, who was the Latinist in the Vatican for, I think, was it Paul? I think it was Pius the 11th, 12th, and then Paul the 6th. It's a good read, short little memoir, but you'll see just how much he loved the Latin language, how much he thought it was a part of the Latin church. You'll also see the sort of, how can I put this, the sort of exaltation of popes and exaltation of the papacy and exaltation of the Latin tradition, which could sometimes be, what's the word I'm looking for, extravagant. Could also be seen as sometimes, and this is the claim that goes against them, is that Rome was, culturally imperialistic. That's the sort of charge. It imposed Latin customs on the rest of the church. This was, denying the legitimacy of customs of other churches. This is the big claim. And as we're going to see in this series, that is partly true. That you're going to see, especially, and this is the thing I'm going to repeat over and over again, The worst instances of this can be found in the modern era. That's from the 19th century onward, really after Vatican I. And of course, this is bound up, though, of course, with earlier claims, because Rome's claims to authority descend from its traditions. From the idea that it's derived from the traditions of the apostles Peter and Paul. This is what, the basis of the See of Rome's claim to govern all the churches. And, that's bound up with the Latin tongue, because when these traditions finally took formal shape, when the church was freed from persecution in the 4th century, Latin had become the standard language for the Church of Rome. And so this gives a sacred character to that language and to all the customs associated with it. But of course, one of the problems, I think, of pushing this idea that Rome isn't culturally imperialistic is that they didn't have an idea of culture like we did before the 19th century. Before the modern period, most people did not think of the customs and traditions of a people or in a group as being their particular culture with all that implies the way we do. I'm thinking things like self-express. We think of like a right to expression. They have a right to. They didn't care about that. They didn't think there was such a thing. They understood, by the way, that pre-modern peoples understood that different peoples had different customs, but they didn't think of them in the same way. And they definitely, and this is the thing about multiculturalism, they definitely didn't think they were all of equal worth. And so that's the idea sort of lurking in the background to a certain degree, at least in the West. I think if you're actually from an Eastern tradition, by the way, you have a very different idea of this. You just didn't like Rome stomping on your customs and things of this nature. But as we're going to see, and I'm going to emphasize in this series, this was not always the case that it was imposed. In fact, a lot of the times it happened... how you put it. It happened there you could have, on occasion, voluntary embrace of Latin traditions. And as you're going to see, this is not without some relationship to what you might think of as being political power. It always does have that dynamic to a certain degree. But it is not uniformly, and this is probably a relief if you're a Latin Christian, it's not uniformly the Latin Church trying to impose itself all the time on the Eastern churches, either those in communion with it or those outside, although it does happen, sometimes sadly, spectacularly, depressingly, in ways that divide the church. And so in this introductory episode, I just want to go with a little background because, as I mentioned, this idea, this problem of Latinization seems to be a modern thing. For the most part, it doesn't really exist in the first millennium of the church's history. That's what I'll go back to here, just how Latin becomes a powerful part of the Western church. Just briefly overview of this. If you don't know, the Roman Empire, by the 1st century, by the time life of Christ, is effectively a bilingual empire. Elites in the Roman Empire spoke both Latin and Greek, more or less until the collapse of the Western Empire in the 470s. I think it's 476. After Christ's death, after his resurrection, the birth of the church, you begin to have, churches organizing around, languages based on region, Greek, Syriac, slightly later Latin. The earliest versions of the Gospels are written in Greek and then Syriac, and then later on only Jerome actually translates an entire Bible into Latin. Probably had some of the Gospels earlier. And so, obviously Christianity was originally an Eastern, quote-unquote, religion. And so Greek and Syriac can claim chronological precedence. And in fact, the early Christian community in Rome almost certainly spoke Greek. Mostly were probably immigrants from the Mediterranean parts of the Roman Empire. But most scholars seem to believe that Latin had become the spoken language of the Roman Church by the 3rd century. You begin to have Latin writers and apologists begin to appear in that time frame, such as Tertullian. And probably by that time, you get into the late 3rd century, early 4th century, it's definitely become the language of the liturgy and the language of the church in the West in a cultural sense. This is when you have in the 4th century the Roman canon being written down, probably at the end of the 4th century, 390-ish, the reign of Pope Damasus, or something like that. Nonetheless, in the earliest centuries, most of the theological disputation and elucidation of dogma that took place in the eastern parts of the empire, where the great centers of learning were, in Athens in Greece, Alexandria in Egypt, and Antioch in Syria. And so most of the early church councils, local or ecumenical, were held in the East. And so Greek held, and therefore must always hold, because these councils, ecumenical councils, are foundational for the life of the church, held a preeminence of its linguistically speaking in the first early centuries of the church. And in fact, it took, Rome made claims, to intervene in the life of the churches, before the 4th century. But it took a while to articulate that as a doctrine of primacy. But it did intervene early on. The most famous of these instances, and this is something like if you wanted to project Latinization back into the early church, it'd be something like this, which is the Easter controversy of the late 2nd century. This might be a single episode someday. All these little things can be episodes in these episodes. It's great. I will never run out of material. In which, if you don't know, Pope Victor I tried to instruct the churches in Asia to celebrate Easter on the date celebrated in Rome. But they'd already developed their own traditions for this. And in fact, he was led to drop this idea by St. Irenaeus of Lyon, the great church father. But in general, the bishops of Rome in this earlier period, and sometimes they claimed to be able to do this, were really in no position to assert their authority in this way until well after the collapse of the Roman Empire, much later. And in fact, up until for a long time, maybe 8th, 9th centuries, maybe until the first years of the second millennium, ties between Rome and Constantinople, the two centers of the empire, were very strong. Bishops of Rome, until the 8th century, were considered themselves to be subjects of the Eastern Roman emperors. We call them Byzantine in the West. That's what we're talking about. And there were lots of ties. Pope Gregory the Great saint, was an ambassador to Constantinople early in his career before he became the Pope. And of course, later on in the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian, raised the dignity of Constantinople to try to make it equal in law to that of quote-unquote Old Rome, as a way of asserting his authority. And just in general, Byzantine emperors, Eastern Roman emperors, had no compunction about arresting or deposing popes and installing their own anti-popes when they felt like doing so. Justinian, in the 6th century, deposed Pope Silverius, and his successor in the 7th century would imprison and make a martyr out of Pope Martin I. I believe he was the last pope to be martyred, I'm mistaken. So you did have this really tense relationship. This is what I mean by, political things come into this in a lot of ways. But just in general, there was a lot of Byzantine influence on Rome in terms of its customs. Things like the liturgy. For example, in the 5th century, this is the 490s, Pope Gelasius was the one who inserted the Kyrie into the Roman liturgy from the Greek liturgy. That's why you have Greek as an original language in the Latin liturgy. And there were, just in terms of personnel, a lot of Eastern popes from the eastern parts for the Greek-speaking East. Between 644 and 751, 14 of 20 popes came from the Greek-speaking East. So there were a lot of ties over time. It took a long time for them to sort of be broken by a lot of different things. By the 7th century, you begin to have these tensions, however, between Rome and Constantinople. You've had the Western Empire collapse. And one of the things that's happening is that the Byzantine Empire can no longer really physically protect popes. They, in the late 6th, early 7th centuries, get into a death struggle with the Persian Empire. And as a way of uniting the empire together to fight the Persians, the Emperor Heraclius in 630 made Greek the official language of the empire as a means of unifying the Byzantines. They all spoke Greek mostly by then. But they had been using, up until then, Latin as the official language of their government. In fact, by the way, they would still, at the coronation of Byzantine emperors, I believe down to its death in 1453, would the Byzantine emperors at their coronations mumble a few words in Latin just to make clear the connection with Constantine the Great and the founding of the Christian Empire like that. But you also had attempts by the Eastern Church and by the emperors to impose Eastern customs on the Latins. Most famously in 692, the so-called Council in Trullo, which was an Eastern Council called by Byzantine Emperor, which meant to legislate disciplinary customs for the entire church. And it's famous because this council, which purported to be an ecumenical one, the West does not recognize it, famously decreed the licitness of married clergy. This is, of course, contrary to the custom of Rome, goes back at least to the end of the 4th century that, their clergy, their secular clergy are celibate. It also, however, tried to impose liturgical customs of the Byzantine Rite on the whole church. Things like the prohibition of celebrating Mass on Holy Thursday, Byzantine fasting customs, the days. I believe theirs are Tuesday, Thursday, and I think those are it. Whereas in the West, by then they had, it was Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. And as well as, this is the interesting thing here, a prohibition of any symbolic depiction of Christ as the Lamb of God. And in fact, popes in the late 7th and early 8th centuries reinstituted Mass on Holy Thursday. It had gone away as a tradition. It came back around this time period. And one of these popes, early 8th century, Pope Sergius, I mentioned the name because it sounds Greek, or at least doesn't sound Latin anyway, added the Agnus Dei to the liturgy. Don't have it. My understanding of this is sketchy. There doesn't seem to be direct evidence, but this seems to be in response to these types of changes. So you do have already in this first millennium the reverse of what you have in the second. Instead of Latinization, I want to say Grecization, Easternization, if you want to put it that way. And what happens, of course, is that culturally over time, these two great churches just begin to grow apart in so much in their customs and in their rights and everything. They begin to see each other really suspiciously for a variety of reasons. Something that was probably going to happen given the separation due to the Islamic conquest, the fact that the Byzantines had to bear the brunt of this, the fact that the West was kind of, it's in the early part of the Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages, didn't have quite the cultural, you could say, confidence or whatever to deal with the Byzantines. And just because they were developing in different ways, kind of cut off from each other. Less so, by the way, in Italy. There's a lot more. Rome maintains ties to the East and has a lot more interest there than, we'll say, the church when it moves north, when the influence moved north. And this is what happens after the year 700, particularly with a couple of different things. One's the iconoclast controversy in the 8th century. This is where you have this, again, this will be an episode, maybe a series, I don't know. Definitely going to talk about iconoclasm at some point, in which Eastern Roman emperors, possibly influenced by their, suffering defeats at the hands of the Arabs, begin to banish images as being, incompatible with, the whole idea of not worshiping graven images and stuff like this. And there is this, decades, if not like centuries long, more than a century long, clash, sometimes violent, between emperors and the supporters, the iconoclasts, the one who want to get rid of images, and the iconojewels, the ones who are lovers of images, as the Greek term goes. And this all seems askance to Rome. They don't have that problem with images there. And so this, again, makes it, seem suspicious to them. It helps, widen the divide between these two regions of the church, because they're having different emphases, different influences. And the influence in the West is coming from the north. I am speaking of Carolingian influence. This is one of the things that really cements we'll use the modern term, cultural divide between Rome and Constantinople. Sort of in the same way that with the triumph of orthodoxy in the Orthodox world, in Constantinople, cements a certain spirituality and devotion, iconographic, veneration of icons, that sort of way of looking at the world where, icons, it's a long story, but I won't go into this too much detail, but very specific to them. You have, with the coming of Charlemagne and his empire and all his scholars who during the so-called Carolingian Renaissance they will sort of exalt the Latin tongue as this sort of sacred tongue of the ancient Western Church. I believe, I may be misremembering this, but I believe Peter Brown compared it to almost it's sort of like a singular icon. Instead of having many icons, Latin becomes the biggest identifying mark of the Western Church. And so by the end of that period, he dies in 814, you have distinct religious cultures that are in competition with each other. And this will feed into more and more conflict. Most spectacularly I believe in the 870s, this begins. In the late 9th century, when you have both the Church at Constantinople and the Church at Rome trying to evangelize the central regions of Europe, Balkans, parts of the Ukraine, and battles over jurisdiction. And again, Rome sees its jurisdiction more or less as universal. The Constantinople does not agree. You begin to have, missionaries clashing in this period. And so this is exacerbated by, it's a long story. They'll have to do one on the Photian Schism too. This is the Photian Schism. What happens is a patriarch of Constantinople is deposed in favor of a brilliant scholar and humanist named Photius, who's a layman, who's made patriarch. And long story short, somebody from Constantinople appeals to Rome. And so it merges this big conflict over whether or not, the original deposition was just or valid canonically, all this stuff. And then it blooms into this jurisdictional fight, which, and this is the thing about Latinization here, you're going to have both sides begin to criticize each other. Like, okay, how we know your theology is faulty? Because you fast on the wrong days, or because this is in a later period, but it's great. One of the things, I'll get to this next time actually, but I love it. I'll mention it here. One trenchant critic of the Latins in the East said they, basically, I'm paraphrasing, claimed they knew the Latins were heretics because they did not wear beards, which is completely true, by the way. No, you get to this attack on customs as a way of attacking by proxy orthodoxy. And Photius was really brilliant. And he's the one who points to defects in Latin theology and connects them to Latin customs, particularly, of course, the use of the filioque clause. It's really to him where he latches onto that to paint the Latin church as, defective, heretical, schismatic, whatever. And so you have this clash of customs. And what we think of as being Latinization, where Rome is kind of imposing on it, on an Eastern church, really starts in the Middle Ages. This is the sort of last flare-up. The schisms, heal by the 880s, 890s. But you're going to have this reemerge with the resurgence, of course, of the Roman Church in the first century of the first millennium, with the Gregorian reform. If you know this, I've actually done a lecture on this before, talk on this before, an episode, in which the Church of Rome begins to reassert itself after a couple of centuries. Rome kind of goes into decline at the end of the first millennium. It reemerges in the latter half of the 11th century and begins asserting its claims to govern the Western Church, but also the Universal Church. And this is where you're going to get clashes with the East, and I'm going to call Latinization proper begins. And so I'm going to end the podcast here. And then next time we're going to start out and we're going to have, just to give you a plan of how we're going to go about this, it may deviate from this a little bit, but next couple of episodes will be broad. Next episode will be on Latinization in the Middle Ages. We're going to talk about the Gregorian reforms, how that influences this, how it doesn't. We're going to talk about actually some of Gregory VII's liturgical reforms. He actually was a liturgical reformer himself. Talk about the Crusades, that aspect of this, both good and evil, on this subject. As you may sound surprising saying good, there is, you'll see, some good things. As well as, because this is another thing we'll get to, is how different monarchs in the borderlands between West and East, talked about and dealt with their Eastern brethren, and some of whom were actually, you'll have openness to it. Others imposed Latin influences on their peoples. And so what you're going to see is, for the most part, I think this era and actually into the next episode after that will be the early modern period. And we're going to cover as broad a spectrum as I can, both in Europe, but also, as you'll see, in the Middle East. relations between Rome and these Eastern churches that come into communion and those that don't. And early modern period, we'll talk about, again, developments post-Council of Trent, because that's the next great sort of centralization, Latinization of the church, and how that affects the Eastern churches. Talk about, and this is the thing I need to notice too here in the early modern period, the writings of Pope Benedict XIV in the 18th century, because Benedict XIV wrote an important encyclical called A Late Sunt, which basically lays out what, for the most part, has been Rome's bottom line throughout most of history, which is they've actually enjoined on the Eastern churches in communion with them to worship in their own right. And in fact, you're going to see really throughout the medieval and early modern period, it's mostly actually Catholic states, Catholic monarchies mostly, imposing things on Eastern churches. For the most part, not Rome itself. And then after those 2 episodes, we're going to have several at the end. I think at least 3, maybe 4, on various parts of the modern era. If you follow my writing in Crisis Magazine, I kind of hinted at some of this. The episode with the Ruthenian or Carpatho-Rusyn Church in America in the 19th and 20th centuries. Probably 1 episode on, again, I mentioned the Syro-Malabar. We'll come back to them at the end. And at least 1 more probably with the Maronites. So at least 3, maybe some more to talk about specific churches at the end of this. So maybe I don't know. We'll say maybe a wrap-up episode, but probably 6 to 7 episodes. That'll be the general layout of the series. Hope this whets your appetite. You'll have more coming soon, and be on the lookout for that sort of thing. Couple of last things, just notes to wrap up here and talk about the podcast going forward. One thing is you'll have another short episode coming soon for patrons. If you're a patron, you'll get this immediately. Remember, if you're not a patron, you have to wait a month. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to drop the episodes on Patreon, and a month from that you'll get everybody else have access to them. So I'll put it on Patreon first, then a month later it'll appear on YouTube and on my podcast platform, I should say, Anchor, and then to Spotify and everywhere else. And the other thing is, after that, there'll be another episode, not a special one, just a standalone, on a topic you won't want to miss. Single episode on the Pearson Integrated Humanities Program. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably know what that is. If you don't, you're in for a treat. If you are, you're in for a treat. As you'll see, I have something special planned for that. And also in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to start actually, because when I first started putting this is a podcast now, but I started actually doing these as talks at my local parish, and I recorded them that way. And some of the earlier talks that I recorded, the audio was really bad. You could barely hear me. I got lots of complaints on pod. This is why I want complaints. I don't care if you're a complaint. I want feedback leave comments on Apple or Patreon or Spotify, anywhere you can. Let me know. And so some of the earlier episodes people couldn't listen to. So I'm going to re-record some of these. And I think the first one I'm going to do actually is my lecture on my episode on the Gregorian reforms, because it's what we're talking about next time. Give you a little detailed background if you don't know anything about that, or if you want to brush up, you can listen to it. That one, by the way, will be free initially. I'm not going to make people wait for that. So it's not a special thing just for patrons. Yes, 2 more items to talk about. One is I have promised interviews. They're going to be starting hopefully hands in prayer March. I need to start contacting people. I need to make sure. I just got my internet up a week or 2 ago. I'm getting things ready here. Try to get that done. Contact people. There'll be interviews. That will be patron only. That'll be bonus content for patrons. I think I can get some very interesting guests lined up. Some of which, at least one, if I can get a hold of them, you've definitely heard of. So I want to preview that. Also, before that, I do want to start doing live streams. I don't know how. I that's something I need to work on, that sort of thing. That may be a visual thing I do. I don't know, on YouTube or whatever. Just so you guys can ask me questions, ask questions about podcasts or something like that. And so leave some feedback, things you might want to talk about, things you might want to hear about, just to talk about things in general, if you like, whatever. At least once a month, do that. for everyone, and eventually I'll do it twice a month, once for everyone and once for subscribers. I only have two patrons right now, so on Patreon. So, but definitely for everybody, pretty soon we'll start doing that. So that is what's upcoming. That's what we're doing. Again, please go and visit us on social media. I'm actually off Twitter for Lent, so don't worry about that. But I'm on Facebook. Visit the page there. Go to YouTube. Please subscribe on YouTube. I am trying to monetize the channel. I'm halfway there. You have to have 1,000 subscribers. I have a little over 500, so it's free. Go ahead and subscribe. And go to Patreon. You can subscribe. If you want to get earlier episodes, all that stuff. If you want access to the interviews, the interview stuff will be only for a certain level of patron. If you go there, it's like I think there's 5, 7, and 10 or whatever. And so they get the bonus content, the $10 a month people. But again, appreciate everyone subscribing, listening. Hope this is useful to everyone. And I forgot to mention, I guess, thank everybody again for listening. Next episode will be a doozy, by the way. Very touchy topic. Be about the drafting of Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes was the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. That one's gonna be touchy, actually. So you'll want to hear that one. So that's what's upcoming. Again, thank you guys. God bless you all. Hope to hear from you guys soon. You'll definitely be hearing from me soon as well. Take care and God bless. See y'all.